John McMullen has his spring stock market report as we are about a month away from training camp. Yesterday we looked at players who have a chance to really break out in training camp. Today we're going to look at players who may have made an impact last year but might be on thin ice this year as we bring in John McMullen at JF McMullen here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline for Football at 4, the Eagles Spring Stock Market Report. Johnny Mac, how are you?
Doing well, Mike. Real quick, yeah, that's Sixers Twitter. I agree with you. Sometimes we don't agree, but I mean, for years, all these people would say to me, superstar, superstar, superstar. And now you don't value second-round picks in the NBA, which history tells us, let's be honest, there's not good odds that you're going to get really impactful players in the second round of the draft. And now they're upset at Elton Brand because they won't take 4th second-round pick. It's amazing.
Yes.
It really is.
Yeah, and keep people forget, they already have Jonah Bolden, Shake Milton, Zaire Smith. They got Thibault now. I mean, how many second-round picks are – I mean, that's 4 players there that are going to be sitting on the bench. I mean, how many second-round room for you think they got an ample bench room here?
Well, and then the part that kills me is the weakness of this organization. And it doesn't matter if you like Sam Hinkie, dislike him. This is over the entire Josh Harris era. Whether he was in charge or Colangelo or Elton Brand, Brett Brown, whoever you want to blame it on, player development has not been the strength of this organization. And you think all of a sudden they're going to develop a bunch of second-round talents? I mean...
Well, I think what it was, John, my opinion is that there was a lot... The Sixers have been so frequently at the top of the draft. Well, this year, they were at the bottom of the draft, so there were more names that were thrown around that you've heard of that were upperclassmen, and you may have seen them in the tournament. So when those guys were available, it was, well, I know that guy, and I've heard of that guy. Well, why didn't you take that guy?
That's exactly what it is. And you're right, and that is part of it, and people overvalue. Again, this is an analytics-based organization. You go back to that ESPN ranking. They were number 1 in all of professional sports, whatever they did that a couple of years ago, for their reliance on analytics. Now, you might like that, you might dislike it. That's not the point. The point is history tells us second-round picks are not valuable. So you try to manipulate the assets in a different way, whether that's creating space optionality, whatever word you want to use. And then the second part is people bring up Draymond Green, the one player that hits and the couple that hit. And again, the weakness has been player development. So it just doesn't make sense to just run all these players to a team that thinks they're going to be a contender. So the last thing you want is young role players on a contender.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt that last night. I felt that last night that, if anything, you should be happy that they traded all these picks away because the message should be they understand that these young guys aren't helping them now. They need veteran players because they're going for it.
Yeah, exactly. It's just amazing to me. It really is.
Yeah. All right.
And you said Eagles Twitter. Yeah, they get unrealistic as well. I think all fan bases do. But sure. It's not as bad. It really isn't.
Well, the stark divide between the one side and the other still exists out there until there will never be a end result, right? I mean, if they win a championship, it would have taken too long. That would have been they won the title. Well, it only took them 10 years. You know what I mean? Like, so if they win.
Well, and both sides are so entrenched. We've talked about this a lot because we're on opposite sides. I mean, one side has already declared itself the winner. And if Sam was still here, everything would have been, they would have had a title and everything would be going in there. So they have already convinced themselves. And the other side that doesn't like it, yeah, they will say, well, it took 15 years. What does that have to do with Sam Hinkie? 8 years, whatever, if it ultimately happens. So both sides have already convinced themselves they're right. And both sides are right about certain things and wrong about certain things, like always.
Yes, there were plenty of mistakes, bumps in the road, positives, negatives. All I know is that there's a team right now that is in a wide-open NBA, and it should be a fun offseason. And Elton Brand has an uphill battle here, bringing these guys back and finding players to fill out this roster. He's only got 6 guys on this roster right now, so he's got a lot of work to do. But let's look into the Eagles roster. It's coming up, training camp about a month away. Yesterday we looked at the Bulls, now the Bears. These are guys who minicamp maybe wasn't the best for them. They got a lot of work to do come training camp to make an impact here. And let's start with a position in Philly that has been very important. It's the backup quarterbacks at training camp. This is going to be something to keep an eye on. And you're writing here that the backup spot wasn't all that impressive.
No, to me it wasn't. I think, number one, I think the Eagles brought in Cody Kessler to try to push Nate Sudfeld. I don't think that happens at all. So I think Nate has sort of already grabbed hold of that second quarterback spot in the backup job that was Nick Foles. And that's not necessarily due to performance. It's just that the other guy was that bad. And didn't show NFL-level arm strength. My main concern with Nate Sudfeld, watching him through 6 practices that we got to see, holds on to the football way too long. And there were times, remember, this is non-contact. This is no pads. You're not allowed to do press coverage. There's obviously no real pass rush coming at you. And Doug Peterson's out there blowing the whistle for safeties. It's a bad sign to me. So that's a big concern. Cody Kessler, as I said, just doesn't have NFL-level arm strength. And Clayton Thorson is a project. I mean, he made a ton of mistakes. We were joking. Every practice ended with a Clayton Thorson interception because you like to end practices on high notes for the offense or defense. So it usually ends with a touchdown or an interception, and it usually ended with an interception because Clayton was throwing it.
Yeah, and we know that's been a very important position that will be scrutinized now. All right, you let Foles go, and this guy's, whoever it is stepping in. Hopefully that person's not needed, right? After 2 years of needing the backup quarterback, let's hope the backup quarterback isn't needed. Let's go to Miles Sanders. He's a guy that we talked a little bit about. But even Doug admitted that his injury and not being able to get on the field in minicamp could delay his, potential impact on the team at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I think when he was drafted, I think the plan, and it's always in sand, as Chip Kelly would say, is that Miles was going to be the complimentary back to Jordan Howard. And that's probably not going to happen. Now, long term, I don't think it's a concern. He's a very talented player. I think he's got a good opportunity to certainly develop into a meaningful piece of that committee approach in the backfield, even this season. But I think when you start talking about week 1, when you miss every single all-season practice as a rookie, you're behind the 8 ball. And that's what Doug admitted. And so when you look at week 1 and you look at the Washington Redskins coming here, I don't think Miles Sanders is going to be ready to hit the ground running as a big part of this offense. And I think that's at least a slight disappointment. So while I say the spring and the Bulls and Bears, and he was a Bear because of the injury, I don't think it's a concern long term, but it's a concern short term, and I don't think he's going to be a big part of the big piece of the puzzle early in the season.
John, Miles Sanders, the running back. Let's go to Matt Collins at wide receiver. He was a draft choice. We're talking about NBA draft. He was a guy a couple of years ago that wasn't the high pick, but hey, he's a third-round pick, and he could be a deep threat, and he's good on special teams, and so far he's amounted to nothing. I mean, I can't think of one play or one moment in Matt Collins' career. He missed all of last year with an injury that I don't know that was even definable. But do you look at Matt Collins as a possible cut?
It's interesting. I think it's closer to that than people realize. I still think default setting for everybody is former fourth-round pick. He did make that one big play, remember, with the backpack dance with the touchdown. Everybody got excited because his size. And there's a numbers problem for wide receivers on this team because of how much depth is here, and bringing back Deshaun Jackson and drafting J.J. Arcega-Whiteside. So 4 guys. I mean, they're making a football team. And that's Jeffrey, Jackson, Aguilar, and Arcega-Whiteside. And if you're keeping 5 or you're keeping 6, which is a possibility, well, all of a sudden you have to start looking at who's in position. Now, Mac has the pedigree as a former draft pick, as you mentioned, but it's interesting because he came in here from North Carolina with this big rep as a great special teams player. Hasn't really shown that. Even last year, he missed the entire season. So I'm not even counting that. I'm saying in his rookie season, it was really Shelton Gibson, who's another guy on this list, that showed up as a special teams player. He was a very good gunner, and that ultimately got him on the field late in his rookie season, last season. So Matt came in with that reputation, but really hasn't shown it off. So when you start talking about those final 1 or 2 wide receiver positions, and then you bring up names like Braxton Miller and Greg Ward and Mark and Michelle, and guess what? They're performing on the practice field as Mac is still trying to get back. Now, the good sign is he was finally doing some stretching and individual work during minicamp. So hopefully he'll be ready for training camp, but he's going to have to make this football team with a good camp. And if it's a bad camp, yeah, you could start talking about cut.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of depth at that position. I don't say depth. A lot of guys that are interesting, a lot of athletes, a lot of intriguing players. And the next guy on your list who's got an uphill battle is Shelton Gibson, who you mentioned Hollins, the backpack dance. I remember one play Gibson has made, and it was that catch against, the Giants down the field. And other than that, hasn't done much. And he was another guy who was, like a 4th or 5th round pick and just really has not been able to crack the rotation or really make much of a factor. But if you're looking at special teams, I guess those two guys are squarely up against each other.
Yeah, and I think at this stage, that's the only path for Shelton Gibson. He had another bad spring catching the football. He just doesn't catch the football consistently enough as an NFL receiver. He just doesn't. And this is year 3. And you would think maybe some of the jitters slowed down, and he did improve last season, but now they're back again. So when I look at, and you're saying plays as a receiver, I mean, that's not even relevant to me anymore as Shelton Gibson. He's a special teams player. And to make this team, he's got to be the best gunner they have. And maybe he will be, because he's played that role in the past, and as I said, he's been very effective at it. But that is literally his only path to this roster, because he is. If you want to go from 1 through 13 and all the receivers they have, all those names I mentioned, Miller, Ward, Michelle, Charles Johnson, all of them, even Carlton Aguadosi, the 6'6" kid, the big lanky kid from Rutgers, all of them were better receivers than Shelton Gibson. So it's just he's a special teams player, and he's got to separate himself in that part of the game.
That sounds like, and like we just mentioned, there's a lot of I don't want to say fringe guys, but guys who are intriguing enough that you're not guaranteed a spot just because you were a draft pick 2 years later now.
No, and we've seen that with Donnell Pumphrey in the backfield. At some point, you do have to admit you always get the benefit of the doubt, and guys like Donnell in the past and Mac Hollins, I think, will still get it for this camp. And Shelton, at some point, that runs out, and it's running out for those two guys. It really is.
And then this one's interesting because in the world of the sports that consistently is evolving now and everybody knows more and there's more information and more depth of knowledge out there, the compensatory pick conspirators are also a loser this minicamp season.
Yeah, I think the hope was that when they were made aware that the Eagles could get a fourth-round pick back. And by the way, it's just could. It's not definite. They could cut. Everybody jumped on that train and said because he had a bad NFC championship game, he's a bad player. Well, I've said from the start two things about that. You're in the NFC championship game, so doesn't that say anything as a starting player? Number one, you've started on a top 5 defense, as I mentioned, 3 different times in his career. The guy can play, and he showed that in the spring. And I think everybody who kind of trumpeted and got on that train from a media standpoint, they realized pretty quickly. You could talk about the Trey Sullivans of the world, Godwin Igwebuike, Blake Countess, who's back. They're not this guy. And we've seen in the past that Jim Schwartz places tremendous value on that third safety position. And he wanted a veteran, and he had it with Corey Graham. This is the veteran. This is the veteran who's got a ton of experience playing at a high level, playing on a good defense. Barring injury, he's going to be on this team.
John, real quick, yesterday the NFL Competition Committee finalized its new rule to review pass interference. They opted against a lot of tweaks and a lot of changes and upheld the original wording that was back in March. So we are going to have some sort of ability to review pass interference, though.
Yeah, I mean, I've said from the start when we talked about it originally, I think it's a bad decision. I think it's an overreaction. And I point to you look at the play, and the play was egregious. And the Saints deserve to be upset, and their fan base deserves to be upset. But the one thing I keep coming back to is, can you look at NFL games consistently and say there were a lot of these types of plays? And the answer is no. You don't see blatant misses like that a lot. So to make a giant change based off one play because it was a big game in a big situation, I think is an overreaction. I think human error is part of the game. It always has been. And people say, look, forget about it from a referee standpoint, an official standpoint. The players make mistakes all the time.
Blandino came out and said, creating a rule for one play, that's a bad rule.
It's a terrible rule. And they did it before with Aaron Rodgers. Remember when Aaron Rodgers was hurt and driven into the ground? They overreacted to that. They constantly do this, and it never works out well. And this will just be another example of that.
Last one, Odell Beckham says, I wasn't going to reach my full potential with the Giants. Is that a shot at Eli saying I couldn't be as good as I could be because my quarterback wasn't very good?
Yeah, I think it is. And there's been he's intimated that in the past as well. I think it's fair. And look, I mean, that's what it is. Receivers are at the mercy of the guy delivering the football. So it doesn't matter how good you are, how talented you are. If somebody can't get you the football consistently, it's going to have a big effect on you. And I think that's fair to say from Odell Beckham's standpoint. And he'll have a better situation in Cleveland with Baker Mayfield, and we'll see how he does. But and that's what I said. I didn't kill the Giants like a lot of people did for the trade, simply because they weren't successful with them. So they had to go in a different direction. They had to rebuild that football team, not just at quarterback, but they needed significant talent at a number of places. And how do you do that? When you have one great player, try to make it into maybe 4 good players. And it's sort of that step back, you can take 2 steps forward. And the Giants are the perfect example because they did it. And when Eli was a young quarterback, the best offensive players they had were Jeremy Shockey and Tiki Barber, but they had awful personalities, and they were hurting the development of Eli Manning. So they got rid of them. Yeah. And guess what? They took a step back, and they took 2 forward and got 2 Super Bowls.
Unbelievable. Still crazy to think about that. Sports Bats Live. He's John McMullen. Football at 4 is in the books for this week. But you can get a subscription to our YouTube channel and listen to it every day, youtube.com/973ESPN. Follow John on Twitter at JFMcMullen. And have a great weekend, man.
You too. Enjoy it.
All right. He's John McMullen, like all guests appearing via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.